My name is Sarah Whitmore, and I'm 35 years old. For most of my life, I believed I was ordinary in the best way possible. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names, where summer evenings smelled like freshly cut grass and barbecues, and where I thought life would always feel safe. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't poor either. I had parents who loved me, a decent education, and a soft, hopeful view of the world. I thought I understood love. I thought it was about sacrifice, about standing by someone even when things got hard. I thought loyalty was the highest form of devotion. And then, I met him. His name was Daniel Carter. When I was 25, Daniel was everything I thought I wanted. Charming, ambitious, and the kind of man who could walk into a room and make people pay attention without even trying. We met at a charity fundraiser in the city. I was helping organize the event for a friend's nonprofit, wearing a simple black dress and holding a clipboard. He was the kind of guest who didn't belong in the crowded banquet hall, too polished, too confident, too sure of his place in the world. He smiled at me, like I was the only person there. And in that moment, I fell for him. Within a few weeks, we were inseparable. He brought me flowers, left sweet notes on my car windshield, and told me I was different from any woman he'd ever known. 6 months later, he proposed. A year later, I was his wife. For a while, it felt like a dream. I moved into his beautiful home, a house with wide windows, hardwood floors, and a garden that bloomed with roses in the spring. I left my modest job at a publishing house because Daniel said, "You don't need to work. I'll take care of everything. Focus on making this house a home." I thought it was love. I thought this was what marriage was supposed to feel like. We'd have dinner parties where his colleagues would praise him endlessly. I'd stand beside him, smiling, pouring drinks, being the perfect hostess. He'd squeeze my hand under the table and whisper, "I couldn't do this without you." I believed him. But over the years, the cracks began to show. Daniel started coming home late. First with excuses about business deals, then without excuses at all. He stopped looking at me the way he used to. Conversations turned into monologues where he talked and I listened. Compliments turned into criticisms. "Why do you wear your hair like that? It makes you look older," he'd say casually over breakfast. "You wouldn't understand how complicated my work is," he'd snap when I asked about the finances. And slowly, I began to shrink. I doubted myself. I stopped asking questions. I tried harder to be what he wanted, thinking maybe if I just stayed patient, the man I married would come back to me. But that man never came back. Instead, he transformed into someone I barely recognized. The night everything shattered was colder than usual. I remember it vividly. I was waiting for him at the dinner table, the candles burned low, and the food was going cold. When the door finally opened, he wasn't alone. She was with him. Lila. Younger, flashier. She smelled of expensive perfume and wore a smile that said she already knew she'd won. Daniel didn't even bother with excuses. He poured himself a drink, walked into the living room with her trailing behind, and looked at me with a smirk. "You're useless," he said. His voice was flat, almost bored. Before I could even respond, his hand lashed out. The sting of his palm across my face sent me stumbling back, my lips splitting against my teeth. I could taste the metallic tang of blood as I fell to the floor. And then he walked out, arm in arm with her, like I was nothing. I sat there on the cold hardwood floor, my cheek throbbing, staring at the door they had just walked through. For a moment I felt so small, smaller than I'd ever felt in my entire life. But then, something shifted. I once believed Daniel was my safe place, the man I had trusted with my heart, my future, my entire life. But that night, as I pressed my trembling fingers against my bruised face, I realized the truth. He was never my safe place. He was my cage. And he thought he had just broken me. But here's what he didn't know. What Daniel never realized, what his arrogance blinded him from, was that long before I met him, I had a life of my own. I had my own name, my own worth. And I had a family legacy he couldn't touch. What he didn't know was that the empire he believed was his, the business he bragged about, the assets he thought he controlled, would one day belong entirely to me. Yes, me, the woman he called useless, the woman he hit, the woman he walked out on. Looking back, I almost laugh at the irony. He thought he was ending me that night. He thought that by humiliating me, by walking out with her, he was proving his power. But what he really did was wake up a part of me I had buried for too long, the part of me that remembered who I was before him. And in the end, he would lose everything he thought he owned. While I would rise. This is where my story begins. Not with the slap, not with the betrayal, but with the moment I realized I didn't have to stay silent anymore. Because the quiet ones, we're not weak. We're patient. And when we move with precision. He called me useless. Then he hit me. Then he walked out. But I was the one who inherited the entire empire. And this is how it happened. I grew up in a quiet little town in upstate New York, where life moved slowly and felt endlessly predictable. Our home was a modest 2-story house with peeling white paint and a porch swing that creaked in the summer breeze. My father worked long hours as a mechanic, his hands always smelling faintly of engine oil, while my mother taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. They didn't have much, but they gave me what truly mattered: love, warmth, and a sense of belonging. In the evenings, I would sit on that porch swing, my head resting on my mother's lap, as she braided my hair and told me stories about how love was supposed to feel safe. She used to say, "When you find the right person, you won't have to question if you're enough. They'll make you feel like you already are." That was the belief I carried into adulthood. I worked hard in school, earned a degree in literature, and landed a job as a junior editor at a small but respected publishing house. I wasn't wealthy, but I was happy. I had a small circle of friends who filled my weekends with laughter and cozy dinners, and I dreamed of someday meeting someone who would love me with the same quiet steadiness I saw in my parents' marriage. I thought I knew what kind of love I deserved. I thought I would recognize it instantly. When I met Daniel Carter, I truly believed I had. He came into my life like sunlight breaking through a cloud. I still remember the first time I saw him standing at a fundraising gala for a local children's charity. I wasn't even supposed to be there. I was helping a friend coordinate volunteers wearing a simple black dress and carrying a clipboard. Daniel was the kind of man who didn't blend into a crowd. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. He had this effortless way of making people lean in closer when he spoke, like his words carried weight. He walked straight toward me holding a glass of champagne and said with an easy smile, "I don't think we've met. How have I missed someone like you at all these events?" I remember laughing awkwardly, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, and explaining that I wasn't a guest, just a volunteer. But he didn't seem to care. In that moment, it felt like he saw me not just someone in the background. Over the next few weeks, he pursued me with a kind of determination that felt flattering and overwhelming all at once. Flowers appeared at my desk, sweet notes tucked into my bag when I wasn't looking. He called me every evening, even if it was just to say goodnight. I had never been treated like that before. Like I was precious, like I was the center of someone's world. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. Daniel was ambitious in a way I admired back then. He owned a small but growing construction company, and he spoke about his business with a spark in his eyes that made you believe in his vision. He told me he wanted to build a legacy, something that would last long after he was gone. And I believed him. When he proposed, it was in the most romantic way I could imagine. A weekend trip to the coast, a private dinner under fairy lights, a ring slipped onto my finger, as he whispered, "I can't imagine a future without you." I said yes, without hesitation. We married in a small ceremony surrounded by family and friends. The church was decorated with white lilies, and when he looked at me at the altar, I thought I saw forever in his eyes. After the wedding, I moved into his beautiful home, a sprawling house with high ceilings and a garden that bloomed in soft colors during spring. For a while, it was everything I had dreamed of. In those early years, I truly believed we were building a perfect life together. Daniel encouraged me to leave my job, saying, "You don't need to stress about work anymore. Let me take care of you." At the time, it felt like love. It felt like security. I told myself I was lucky to have a man so capable and confident, someone who wanted to provide for me. So I left the publishing house. I traded editing manuscripts for organizing dinner parties. I learned the schedules of his clients, memorized the names of their wives, and became the perfect hostess for his business gatherings. I gave up pieces of myself, quietly believing that was what love required. I stopped writing, even though I'd once dreamed of publishing my own book. I stopped meeting my friends for coffee because Daniel often worked late, and I wanted to be home when he came back. I adjusted, compromised, reshaped my world around his. And every time doubt crept in, every time I wondered if I was losing too much, he would disarm me with charm. "You're the reason I can do all this," he'd say, kissing my forehead. "You're the calm in my storm, Sarah." And I believed him. Now, looking back now, I can see the red flags. The way he would subtly criticize my decisions. The way he kept control over the finances, insisting it was simpler that way. The way he slowly distanced me from the people I loved, claiming they didn't really understand our life. But at the time, I thought I was being a good wife. I thought loyalty meant bending until it hurt. I thought love meant staying, even when it felt heavy. Sam, if you had met me then, you would have seen a woman who seemed to have it all. A beautiful home, a handsome, successful husband, a life without financial worry. I smiled at dinner parties, I held his hand in public. I played the role so well that even I believed it. What no one saw were the quiet moments of loneliness, the nights I stayed awake waiting for him to come home, the way my voice got smaller every time he dismissed me with a careless laugh. But I told myself it was just a phase. I told myself all marriages go through rough patches. I never imagined that the man who once whispered promises of forever would one day look me in the eye and call me useless. At that time, I was still the woman who would defend him. I was still the woman who believed in his potential more than my own. I didn't know yet how much pain was waiting for me. I didn't know that betrayal was already creeping in like a slow, silent poison. And I didn't know that everything he thought he controlled was never truly his at all. It's important for you to understand this part, the girl I was before everything fell apart, because the heartbreak wouldn't have cut so deep if I hadn't loved him so completely. And the betrayal wouldn't have felt like a knife if I hadn't handed him my trust with both hands. This was the beginning, the warm golden light before the storm, the calm before I saw his true face, the fragile peace before I learned that the life I thought I was living was a carefully crafted illusion. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single moment when I woke up and thought, something is wrong. It was gradual, like a hairline fracture spreading across glass. At first it was small things. Daniel stopped lingering at the breakfast table. He used to sip his coffee slowly. Tell me about the day ahead. Ask about mine, even if I didn't have much planned. But slowly, his mornings became rushed. He would glance at his phone before even saying good morning. He'd leave his plate half finished, kiss my cheek distractedly, and say, "I have a meeting. Don't wait up." Evenings changed too. He used to call if he was running late. He'd text me photos of his lunch or something funny he saw during the day. But soon, the messages stopped. Then, the phone calls stopped. And eventually, he stopped coming home at a reasonable hour at all. I'd sit alone at the dining table, the food I made going cold, telling myself he was just busy. When I asked gently where he'd been, he'd sigh heavily, like my curiosity was a burden. "Sarah, I'm trying to grow this business. Do you have any idea how stressful it is? Why can't you just trust me?" I'd swallow the lump in my throat and nod, telling myself I was overthinking it. After all, he was building a company. Maybe I just didn't understand how much pressure he was under. But the little things kept piling up. One afternoon while I was putting away laundry, I noticed a receipt in his pants pocket, an expensive dinner for two at a restaurant in the city. A restaurant we had never been to together. When I asked about it, he barely looked up from his laptop. "Client dinner," he said flatly. "You wouldn't know him. Stop snooping through my stuff." The word snooping stung. I hadn't been snooping, I was just folding his clothes. But I let it go. The next week, there was another receipt, this one for a hotel room. When I asked, he laughed a short, humorless sound. "Sarah, you're being ridiculous. Sometimes I stay in the city if it's too late to drive back. Stop imagining things." And I believed him, because I wanted to. His tone toward me started to shift too. In the early years, he always complimented me, even on the smallest things. He'd tell me I looked beautiful in the simplest dress. He'd thank me for making dinner. He'd hold my hand just because. But gradually his words became sharper. "Are you really wearing that?" he'd ask, glancing at me with a hint of disdain. Or, "You wouldn't understand how complex my work is. Just stick to the house. It's better that way." Sometimes he'd say, "You're lucky you don't have to worry about real problems. I take care of everything." The way he said lucky made me feel small, like I was a child being scolded for not appreciating a toy. Odd. The house began to feel heavy. Even the room seemed colder. I noticed unopened bills on his desk, envelopes from the bank marked urgent. When I asked, he brushed it off with that same tired sigh. "Cash flow is tight right now. It's normal in business. Stop worrying about things you don't understand." I told myself it was just a temporary setback. After all, businesses have ups and downs. But I couldn't ignore the way he'd flinch when his phone buzzed, or the way he started taking calls in another room with the door closed. Once I accidentally caught a glimpse of an email on his computer. It wasn't just business trouble. There were late fees on loans I didn't even know existed. And then there was the scent. It wasn't mine. Daniel started coming home smelling like a different perfume, something sweet and heavy, the kind I'd never wear. At first, I tried to explain it away. Maybe it was from a client. Maybe someone hugged him at a meeting. But the smell lingered too long. It clung to his shirt, his hair. When I mentioned it, he looked at me like I was crazy. "You're imagining things," he said. "Don't start acting paranoid. That's not attractive." And like a fool, I let him convince me that my instincts were wrong. I also noticed changes in his spending. New suits, a more expensive watch, dinners at places he never took me. There was a charge for a luxury spa in another city. When I asked why we were suddenly spending so much money, he snapped. "Do you think money just appears out of thin air? I'm working harder than ever. Don't question how I use it." It wasn't just the money. It was the secrecy. He started guarding his phone like it was made of gold. He never left it unattended. He changed the passcode. And if I so much as glanced at it when it buzzed, he'd snatch it away. One night, after he'd fallen asleep on the couch, I walked past his phone as it lit up. A name I didn't recognize flashed across the screen with a message that made my stomach twist. "I miss you already. Can't wait for tomorrow night." I froze. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't wake him. I just stood there in the dark, staring at the screen, until the message disappeared. And then I quietly went upstairs to our bedroom and lay in bed wide awake until dawn. Still, I clung to hope. I told myself it couldn't be what it seemed, that maybe I was wrong, that maybe if I was more patient, more understanding, things would go back to the way they were. Because admitting the truth felt impossible. If I admitted it, I would have to face the reality that the man I built my life around was no longer the man I thought I knew. But deep down I knew. I knew something was unraveling. I just didn't know yet how deep the betrayal went. And I didn't know that behind the cracks I was seeing there were entire hidden layers of lies waiting to surface. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. To our friends, we were still the perfect couple. He still smiled at me in public, still held my hand at parties, still called me darling when people were watching. But when the doors closed, the mask slipped. His eyes turned cold, his voice turned sharp. And my home, once filled with warmth and laughter, became a place I barely recognized. At this point, I still thought there was a chance to save it. I still believed he loved me somewhere deep down. I still believed he was just lost in the pressures of work, that maybe if I supported him a little more, he'd remember who we were. But I was wrong. So terribly wrong. Because what was coming next wasn't just distance. It wasn't just secrets. It was a betrayal so deep it would shatter everything I thought I knew. The first undeniable truth came quietly, almost deceptively simple. It wasn't some dramatic confession or an obvious slip. It was just one of those moments when the pieces finally clicked, and suddenly you couldn't pretend anymore. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon. Daniel had left for what he claimed was an overnight conference in the city. I had decided to clean the study, a room he'd slowly claimed entirely for himself. It had been months since I'd stepped inside. His papers and files were usually scattered across the desk in what he called organized chaos. As I began to tidy, I noticed an envelope lying slightly open on the floor, half hidden under the desk. It wasn't like the usual bills or letters we received. The paper was heavier, embossed with a gold crest. Curious, I picked it up. It was an invoice from an upscale hotel I had only ever seen in glossy magazines. A 2-night stay in a luxury suite, complete with a detailed list of charges, champagne in-room dining for 2 spa treatments. And it was dated for the same weekend he told me he had been working late on a major deal. My hands shook as I read it over and over. My mind scrambled for excuses. Maybe it was a client. Maybe he booked it for someone else, his business partner, a guest, anyone. Maybe there was an explanation I just didn't understand. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. That evening I called him. I tried to keep my voice steady, casual. "How's the conference?" I asked. There was a pause, just a second too long. "It's fine. Busy. I'll probably be home late tomorrow." "Don't wait up." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Which hotel are you staying at?" He chuckled lightly. "Why, planning to surprise me?" "I'm just curious," I said softly. "The usual place," he replied vaguely. "Does it matter?" I didn't push further. I hung up, my heart pounding in my chest. When the call ended, I sat in the silence of that study, staring at the hotel invoice on the desk. My first concrete proof. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. But even then I told myself maybe it wasn't what it seemed. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe he had booked it for a client. Maybe the in-room dining was just a meeting. Maybe the spa charges were for himself. I clung to those maybes because the alternative, that he was sharing that hotel room with another woman, was too painful to fully accept. I decided to wait, to watch, to gather more before accusing him of something that might destroy everything. A few days later, another clue surfaced. We were at dinner, sitting across from each other in a quiet little restaurant we used to love. I had suggested we go out, hoping to reconnect, to remind him of the early days when we actually enjoyed each other's company. But the entire time, his attention was on his phone. His thumb moved quickly over the screen, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Who are you texting?" I asked, trying to sound lighthearted, not jealous. He looked up, his expression instantly guarded. "No one. Work stuff." "Must be important," I said softly. "Sarah." He sighed, irritation creeping into his tone. "Can we not do this? I came here to relax, not to be interrogated." I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Of course. Sorry, I didn't mean to." But before I could finish, his phone lit up on the table. A name appeared on the screen, Lila, and below it the preview of a message, "Can't stop thinking about last night." Assad. He snatched the phone before I could read more. "What was that?" I asked quietly. He glared at me. "It's nothing." It didn't look like nothing. "Sarah." His voice turned cold sharp. "Don't start." I stared at him, my stomach twisting into knots. "Who is Lila?" "She's a client," he said flatly, without a hint of hesitation. "She's helping me with some networking. Don't blow this out of proportion." But the look in his eyes told me the truth. I didn't press further, not because I believed him, but because I wasn't ready for what pressing would mean. That night when we got home, he didn't come to bed. He stayed downstairs in the study, the door shut, the faint glow of his phone lighting the darkness under the crack of the door. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of a marriage I no longer recognized. The days that followed only confirmed what I already knew, but couldn't yet say out loud. I saw the way his lips curved into a soft smile when he read certain messages. I noticed how quickly he deleted them. He started wearing cologne again, the expensive kind he hadn't touched in years. He bought new clothes. He even started going to the gym, something he hadn't cared about since our honeymoon. He was becoming someone else, someone I didn't recognize. At the same time, the financial inconsistencies grew harder to ignore. I found another letter in the mail, this one from the bank. An overdraft notice for an account I didn't even know existed. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off. Business expenses. It's temporary. Stop worrying about things you don't understand. But the more I looked, the more I found. Credit card statements with strange charges, loans taken out in his name, late fees stacking up. It wasn't just an affair. It was something bigger, something deeper. He was lying about more than just where he spent his nights. I wanted to scream. I wanted to confront him and demand the truth. But instead, I stayed quiet. I told myself he was just stressed. That maybe this was all a phase. That maybe if I supported him more, he would come back to me. So I tried. I cooked his favorite meals. I stopped asking questions. I smiled when he came home late, even though my heart was breaking a little more each time. Because I still loved him. And I wasn't ready to let go of the dream I had built. But love can't survive on dreams alone, and deep down I knew it was slipping away. Every time his phone buzzed, my chest tightened. Every time he walked out the door with that distant look in his eyes, I felt another piece of my hope crumble. I was living with a stranger who wore my husband's face. Still, there was a part of me that believed, hoped he would wake up, that he would remember who we used to be, that he would look at me the way he did on our wedding day and realize he was making a mistake. But the truth was, he was already too far gone. And the first reveal, the hotel receipt, the message from Lila, the financial lies, was only the beginning. There were deeper betrayals waiting. Darker truths I hadn't even begun to uncover. And soon they would come crashing down around both of us. It was a Friday night, the kind of night that once would have been ours. In the early days of our marriage, Fridays were sacred. We'd order takeout, open a bottle of wine, curl up on the couch, and talk about our week. Back then, Daniel would look at me like I was the only thing in the room that mattered. But that Friday felt different. The house was unnervingly quiet, heavy with an unfamiliar tension. I had prepared his favorite dinner, rosemary roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with garlic, and the bottle of Merlot he always claimed helped him relax after a long week. I set the table for 2 lit candles, tried to recreate the warmth we used to have. I wanted to believe it could still be salvaged. Hours passed. The food went cold. The candles burned low. My phone remained silent. When I finally heard the front door open, relief flooded me, quickly replaced by dread. When I saw he wasn't alone. She walked in behind him. Lila, the woman whose name I'd seen flashing on his phone. She was exactly as I had imagined, young, striking, polished in a way that made me feel painfully plain. Her perfume, sweet and overwhelming, filled the hallway. She didn't look at me with shame or apology. She looked at me with triumph. Daniel didn't even flinch as he brought her into our home. "Sarah," he said flatly, shrugging off his jacket. "This is Lila. She's a friend from work." A friend. I stood frozen, my fingers gripping the back of the dining chair. A friend. "You're bringing a friend home at midnight." He smirked. "Don't start." Lila tilted her head, smiling faintly. "You didn't tell me your wife would be awake?" she said softly, her voice dripping with false innocence. "My wife." The words hung between us like an accusation. I felt the heat rising in my chest, the confusion and rage mixing into something sharp. "What is this? Why is she here?" Daniel's eyes narrowed. "She's here because she belongs here. Maybe if you actually understood what I need, I wouldn't have to." He stopped himself, but it was too late. The words cut deeper than any slap could have. Wouldn't have to, what? I asked, my voice trembling. Wouldn't have to find someone who supports me, who makes me feel alive. The room spun. I wanted to scream, to throw the wine glass in my hand, to demand how he could bring her into the home we built together. But before I could find the words, he stepped closer. "Look at you," he said, his voice laced with disgust. "Standing there in that same old dress, in this same boring house, waiting like some pathetic puppy. You've become useless, Sarah, absolutely useless." My breath caught in my throat. Useless? Yes. His voice rose now, anger flickering in his eyes. "You do nothing. You are nothing. Do you think staying home cooking dinner, pretending this makes you a good wife? You're a weight around my neck." Lila's soft laugh echoed from behind him. Something inside me broke. "After everything I've given up for you, you call me that?" He stepped even closer, his presence towering over me. "You should be grateful I kept you this long." And then, without warning, his hand came down. The sound of the slap was louder than I expected, sharp and hollow against my skin. My head snapped to the side. I stumbled back, my cheek, burning tears stinging my eyes before I could stop them. For a moment there was silence. I tasted blood. I looked up at him, my vision blurry, and saw no remorse in his face. Behind him, Lila didn't move. She didn't gasp or protest. She just stood there, arms folded, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Now you see," Daniel said coldly. "You've never been enough, and you never will be." Then, as if I were a discarded piece of furniture, he turned away. "Let's go," he said to her, his voice suddenly soft again. She slipped her arm into his, and together they walked out the door without another glance back at me. The door slammed shut. And I was alone. I sank to the floor, my legs giving out beneath me. The hardwood felt cold against my palms. I pressed my trembling fingers against my swollen cheek, trying to steady my breath, but the sobs came anyway, silent at first, then louder, until they filled the empty room. The candles flickered. The dinner sat untouched, the wine glass tipped over, spilling across the tablecloth like a dark wound. I had never felt smaller. That was the night the illusion shattered completely. There was no more pretending, no more maybes, no more excuses about business trips, about stress, about temporary distance. He wasn't just distracted. He wasn't just tired. He was gone. The man I thought I married no longer existed. And yet, even in that moment of despair, a strange, quiet clarity began to creep in. For so long, I had bent myself into someone I thought he wanted. I had given up pieces of my identity, convinced myself that love meant sacrifice, loyalty, endurance. But all along he had been taking my trust, taking my time, taking the best years of my life while giving nothing back. And when I was no longer convenient, he discarded me like I was nothing. I stayed on that floor for hours. I don't remember how long exactly, long enough for the candles to burn out, long enough for the darkness to settle thick around me. But in that silence, I made a decision. Not to fight for him, not to beg him to stay, not to try and fix what was already beyond repair. No. I decided that if he thought I was weak, I would show him exactly how wrong he was. Because here's the thing about people like Daniel, they mistake kindness for weakness. They mistake patience for naivety. And when they think they've broken you, they don't see what's quietly awakening beneath the surface. As I sat there in the dark, wiping the tears from my face, I felt it's something I hadn't felt in years. Resolve. He thought walking out with her would destroy me, but all he did was set me free. The betrayal was complete. The humiliation was absolute. But it was also the turning point. Because from that night on, I wasn't just his wife. I wasn't just the woman waiting at home. I was the woman who would rise. And in the end, the empire he thought was his would crumble into my hands. After that night, the slap, the humiliation, the way he walked out with Lila, I thought I had reached the lowest point of my life. I thought there was nothing left to lose. But sometimes rock bottom is exactly where you start to see the truth clearly. When Daniel left, I didn't scream or call anyone. I didn't chase him. I didn't even cry the next day. Instead, I moved through the house silently like a ghost in my own home. And in that silence, my mind began to clear. Because if he thought I would sit there forever, waiting for him to decide my worth, he didn't know me at all. The first thing I did was call Melissa, an old friend I'd lost touch with years ago. She had always been wary of Daniel, had warned me early on to be careful. Melissa was now a paralegal at a reputable law firm. When she heard the trembling in my voice, she didn't ask for details. She simply said, "Come to my office. Bring anything you can find, bank statements, property documents, whatever you have access to." That same afternoon, I went into Daniel's study with a new purpose. I started opening every drawer, every file cabinet. I pulled out folders thick with paperwork I'd never bothered to read before. Deeds, tax forms, loan applications, business contracts. My fingers skimmed through them like I was sifting through the ashes of our marriage. And then I found something I wasn't expecting. A folder labeled Whitmore Trust. At first, the name barely registered. It was my maiden name, but I assumed it had nothing to do with me. My parents had been modest, middle-class people. There was no trust. But curiosity made me open it. Inside, there were legal documents from years ago, long before I met Daniel. And as I read them, my heart began to race. They were inheritance papers. I learned something that day that Daniel never fully understood. My grandfather, whom I had barely known, had been quietly wealthy. He had owned a string of properties, investments, and shares in several businesses. When he passed away, he left his estate not to my parents, but directly to me, his only grandchild, placing everything into a trust that would activate in my name when I turned 30. The trust held significant assets, including a controlling stake in Carter and Whitmore Development, the very construction company Daniel now claimed as his own. My name was on every major document, not his. I sat there at Daniel's desk, staring at the papers in disbelief. All this time, the empire he bragged about, the company he used to boost his ego, the wealth he flaunted in front of everyone was only his in name. Legally, the core of it had been mine all along. When we got married, Daniel insisted on merging certain assets, convincing me it was simpler that way. I never cared to question it. I thought he was just being practical. But in reality, he'd been using my inheritance as the backbone of his ambitions. He built his illusion of power on my foundation. And here was the twist he didn't see coming. Because of the way my grandfather structured the trust, Daniel never had full control. He couldn't sell, liquidate, or transfer key parts of the company without my signature. He thought he owned it. He didn't. Shocked. The more I read, the more the puzzle came together. Daniel was drowning in debt. He had been secretly taking loans against smaller assets, gambling on high-risk investments, and using money to impress Lila. He was siphoning funds from the business to keep up appearances. But the big pieces, the major contracts, the properties with actual value, the majority shares, were untouchable without me. And now, with Melissa's help, I knew exactly how to lock him out of everything. Melissa's face lit up with a mix of shock and grim satisfaction when I showed her the documents. "Sarah," she said slowly, "do you realize what this means? He can't touch the trust. He can't touch the primary business assets. If you want to, you can cut him off completely. Legally, he's nothing without your consent." I sat there in stunned silence for a moment. "So, all this time?" "Yes," she nodded. "All this time, he's been parading around like he owns an empire that never actually belonged to him." I laughed then. It was a hollow, disbelieving laugh, but it was the first time I had felt even a flicker of power in weeks. Daniel thought he'd won. He thought leaving with Lila, calling me useless, would leave me broken. But he didn't know the ground he was standing on was never his to begin with. Over the next few days, I worked with Melissa quietly. We transferred full control of the trust back into a private holding, securing every asset. We froze joint accounts. We filed a motion to review the company's finances under suspicion of fraud. And I signed a temporary management agreement, handing oversight of the key contracts to a neutral trustee, effectively stripping Daniel of operational control. All of it was legal. All of it was airtight. When the dust settled, Daniel would find himself locked out of his illusion. I didn't tell him. I let him keep living in his fantasy, thinking he was untouchable. For 2 weeks he flaunted Lila around town. He drove the car I paid for, wore suits bought with my inheritance, and told anyone who would listen how liberated he felt now that he was rid of his burden of a wife. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the walls were quietly closing in. The first blow came in the form of a notice from the bank. Without my signature, his pending loan renewal was denied. His line of credit was frozen. Suddenly, the money he thought would always be there was gone. Then came the company board's emergency meeting. They informed him that due to legal restructuring, his access to key accounts was suspended pending review. And finally, a courier arrived at his office with a formal notice from my lawyer. Effective immediately, I was asserting my rights as majority shareholder of Carter and Whitmore Development. The news spread fast. Within days, Daniel's business partner called me stunned, apologetic, and eager to work with me instead. The board members who once bowed to Daniel's charm quickly shifted their loyalty. And Daniel, he was blindsided. He tried calling me at first angry, then confused, then panicked. I didn't answer. Meanwhile, Lila started to notice the cracks. The lavish dinners stopped. The weekend trips disappeared. His credit cards began to decline. The man who had promised her the world suddenly looked ordinary. And just like that, her interest in him faded. It was poetic. The very empire he used to impress her to make himself look powerful had always been mine. And by trying to destroy me, he had unknowingly destroyed himself. The night I learned the full truth of my inheritance was the night I stopped feeling like a victim. I realized I didn't need to fight him in the way he expected. I didn't need to scream, to beg, to argue. All I had to do was quietly stand on the truth that had been there all along. He thought he could erase me, but in the end, he had built his entire illusion on my name. And when it all came crashing down, there would be no one left to catch him, not me, not Lila, no one. The day I chose to reclaim my life, it was calm and strangely quiet. No dramatic soundtrack, no explosion of rage, just a steady, deliberate rhythm to each step I took. For weeks I had moved silently, gathering documents, signing papers with Melissa's guidance, securing what was mine. And now the last piece of the puzzle was ready. The divorce papers. Alongside them was the protective order that would bar Daniel from the house and any attempt to harass or intimidate me. There was also the official motion to remove him from any remaining decision-making roles in Carter and Whitmore Development. Melissa slid the final stack of papers toward me in her office. "This is it," she said softly. "Once you sign, it's all in motion." I picked up the pen. For a brief moment, I hesitated, not because I wanted him back, but because I was grieving the version of myself who had once believed in him. Then I signed. Each stroke of ink felt like a cut through the chains I didn't even know I'd been wearing. It was done. The next morning, Daniel arrived at his office as usual, thinking it was just another day of pretending he still had control. But before he could even settle into his chair, a courier walked in with a thick envelope. He opened it in front of his staff. Inside were the divorce papers, and stapled to the top was the court order freezing his access to all major accounts. His face went pale. Before he could process what was happening, another email notification popped up on his computer. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting. His business partner was now siding with me, the legal majority shareholder. Within hours, he was locked out of the company he had boasted about for years. He called me over and over again. At first, the voicemails were filled with disbelief and outrage. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing? You can't do this to me. That company is mine." Then they turned to anger. "You think you're smart. You think you can ruin me. You'll regret this." And finally, they turned to something pitiful. "Please, Sarah. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. We can fix this. Just call me." I didn't answer a single one. When the accounts froze, the lavish lifestyle he had promised Lila crumbled overnight. Her designer bags stopped appearing. The expensive dinners vanished. The car payments bounced. And just like that, Lila was gone. Melissa told me someone had seen her at the airport with 2 suitcases boarding a flight out of state. She didn't even leave Daniel a note. Meanwhile, the town started talking. The whispers about Daniel's perfect marriage had already shifted to whispers about his affair. Now they turned into open gossip about his downfall. Clients canceled contracts. Investors pulled back. The man who once strutted into community events with a smug smile now avoided public places altogether. His name was no longer said with admiration. It was spoken with pity, or worse, mockery. I didn't need to humiliate him. He did that himself. All I did was remove the safety net he had assumed would always be there. A week later, I drove by the old company building. Through the glass windows, I saw him sitting at his desk, with his head in his hands, surrounded by empty file boxes. His once tailored suit was wrinkled. His hair was unkempt. He looked smaller, somehow deflated. There was no satisfaction in seeing him like that. Not really. What I felt was closure, because I finally understood that his downfall was never my burden to carry. After the legal dust settled, the house was legally mine, something my grandfather had ensured when he tied the property into the trust. I spent the next few weeks transforming it. I repainted the walls, removing the cold grays Daniel had chosen for a more modern look. I tore down the heavy curtains and let the sunlight flood back in. I filled the kitchen with colors and warmth again. The study, once his fortress of secrets, became my art studio. I set up an easel, scattered brushes and paints across the desk, and let the room breathe a new kind of life. Every change felt like peeling away the last traces of him. I started seeing old friends again. Melissa and I began having coffee every Saturday morning. I reconnected with Claire, my college roommate, and we spent hours laughing about the things we used to dream about when we were young. I even went back to the community center and signed up for an art class, the one thing I'd given up years ago, because Daniel had told me it was a waste of time. It was in that class that I met people who didn't care about my past, people who saw me for who I was now. And in the evenings, I found peace in small routines. I adopted a dog from the local shelter, a scruffy golden retriever named Daisy, who had been abandoned by her previous owners. The first night she curled up next to me on the couch, I realized how long it had been since the house had felt truly alive. For the first time in years, I didn't feel lonely in my own home. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to spiral. He tried everything. He called, texted, even showed up once at the edge of the driveway, disheveled, desperate, pleading. But the restraining order held. The deputies escorted him away, without me having to say a word. Later I heard he'd moved into a dingy motel on the outskirts of town. His credit cards were maxed out. The loans he'd hidden were coming due. And without access to the company, he had no way to climb back. His name, once synonymous with power, now carried nothing but shame. People asked me if I felt vindicated. But the truth is, revenge didn't feel loud or fiery the way you see in movies. It felt quiet, almost soft. It was the peace of knowing I didn't need to hurt him to win. I just needed to stop holding up the illusion he'd built. When I finally let go, he fell on his own. The closure didn't come from watching him lose everything. It came from realizing I had gained myself back. I wasn't the woman waiting by the door anymore. I wasn't the wife bending herself into silence just to keep someone else happy. I was my person again. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel heavy. It felt open. One evening I sat on the porch with Daisy at my feet, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft hues of gold and pink. I sipped my tea and felt the quiet settle around me. Not the suffocating quiet of loneliness, but the comforting quiet of freedom. I thought about Daniel then, just briefly. About how he called me useless. About how he thought leaving me for someone younger, shinier would give him more power. But all he really did was expose himself. Because in the end, the empire he tried to claim, the life he tried to build on, lies it was never his to begin with. And now, it was mine. Truly, fully mine. He lost everything: money, status, the mistress who left him the moment the funds dried up. And I gained everything: freedom, clarity, and a life that finally belonged to me. That was the real victory. I used to think the worst thing that could happen was losing him. For so long, my entire identity was tied to being his wife. I thought my worth was measured by how well I supported him, how much I sacrificed to keep our marriage afloat. I believed that if he left me, I would have nothing. But I was wrong. Losing him didn't leave me empty. It made room for me to find myself again. In the months after everything unfolded, I began to see my life with fresh eyes. I realized how much of myself I had buried to keep him happy. My hobbies, my friendships, my ambitions, they had all been pushed aside for a man who never truly saw me. I had been living in the shadow of someone else's dream, forgetting that I had dreams of my own. Taking back the company, the house, and the legacy my grandfather left me wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was always mine, not just the assets, but the sense of dignity and autonomy I had allowed him to strip away. And as I rebuilt, I understood something deeper. True. Strength is often quiet. It doesn't scream, it doesn't seek attention. It just endures, waiting for the right moment to rise. I no longer think of Daniel with hatred. Hatred takes too much energy. It keeps you tethered to the person who hurt you. And I don't want him to own another piece of me, not even in my thoughts. Now when I think of him, it's with a strange sense of gratitude. Not for the pain, not for the betrayal, but for the clarity. Because if he hadn't tried to break me, I might never have realized how strong I truly was. These days my life is quieter, but it's mine. I spend my mornings walking Daisy along the tree-lined streets, sipping coffee as the world slowly wakes up. I've started painting again, filling canvases with colors that feel alive, vibrant, unapologetic. The company that Daniel tried to claim is now under new leadership, one that values integrity and honesty. I work with the board occasionally, but I no longer let it consume my life. I've learned that success is sweetest when it doesn't come at the cost of your soul. And most importantly, I've surrounded myself with people who see me not just the roles I play or the things I can provide. I know there are others out there who feel trapped the way I once did. Maybe you're reading this right now, sitting in a house that feels less like a home and more like a cage. Maybe you've been told you're not enough, that you'd be nothing without the person who's slowly erasing you. I want you to hear this. You are more than their words. You are more than the lies they tell you about yourself. And sometimes it takes losing everything you thought you needed to discover that you already had everything you truly needed within you. Daniel thought breaking me would make me small, but in losing him, I found myself. I found my voice. I found my strength. I found the freedom to create a life that wasn't defined by someone else's expectations. And in the end, everything he thought he could take, my home, my security, my future, remained mine, because it was never his to begin with. When I look back now, I don't see a story of defeat. I see a story of transformation. The woman who once stood on that cold hardwood floor bleeding and humiliated is gone. In her place is someone wiser, stronger, and infinitely more alive. I'm not the victim of his choices. I'm the author of my ending. So I'll leave you with this question. Have you ever been underestimated only to rise stronger? Tell me your story. I want to hear it. Because stories like ours matter. They remind others in the dark that there's a way out, a way forward, a way to rebuild. And if my journey resonates with you, if it reminds you that quiet strength can be the most powerful force of all, then stay connected. Follow for more stories of resilience, justice, and the kind of courage that doesn't need to be loud to be unforgettable. Because at the end of it all, I've learned one unshakable truth. People who try to break you don't realize they're simply shaping the edges of your strength. And sometimes the best revenge is not their destruction. It's your peace.